does that also, does it happen where your brain prefrontal cortex is hijacked during both the type 1 and type 2 mania?
I don't think so during depression. Like, if anything, there's been a bunch of stuff, and they're like, people who suffer depression are like more aware of the misery of the world, and that is really, you just lean into it. You just wallow in how awful everything is, and sort of project that on. But yeah, so you do guilt, shame, and regret for everything you did, everybody you hurt. And just like, God, if I could just go back and, not have gotten into that relationship, not have just been into this particular thing that led me down this path. But if it hadn't been that, it would have been something else. The other thing he talked about is you're going through part of your life where you lack MVP, meaning, value, purpose. And I was 44. I don't know what to do anymore. It's out of my field. I was out of sports. Now what? But I think the bigger thing, and this goes to something you asked earlier, as far as everybody has good days and productive days and bad days and sad days. And he goes, look, the goal of all of this with the medication is narrowing the road, right? So the way I sort of describe it, like, mania is up here and hypomania is here and depression is here. Mania is up here and super depression is down here, right? And when you go from this to this, it is like falling off a cliff. For whatever reason, I tended to ramp up into mania a little bit more slowly. But man, when I crashed, it was overnight, and it was dramatic. You go from being on top of the world to someday I'm going to die and nobody will remember me. And he goes, look, if this is normal, this is the human experience. You got your good days, you got your bad days. We're trying to get you from here back to here. And he goes, yeah, you'll have days where you're depressed and unhappy, and you'll have days where you're energized and productive, but that's normal, right? There is no, if you expect your life to just be like this, or as I've talked about in other contexts, one of the things I think where social media and the internet has really caused a lot of damage in this regard is people only talk about how great their life is. And it has given people a false expectation that if their life is not great 24/7, 365, they're failing. Mm-hmm. That is something I think has come out of a lot of that it's given people anyway. So, so that came out of that. Something else I do want to mention as far as my medication is they had me take this genetic test, which again, I'm so glad I got into sort of a very science-based evidence. They kept up with the research. And one of the things that came back is, are y'all familiar with the MTHFR mutation?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Which I always think is funny, because whenever it looks like a curse word, I just find it amusing that that's the abbreviation. But they did that, and I have a single MTHFR gene mutation. And what that means is that I don't convert folic acid to methylfolate in the brain, and that's turning out to be super critical. And I even looked at it, and for some reason, people of Middle Eastern descent are more likely to have this. And at some point I should go try to figure out why, but it doesn't matter. So the other thing they put me on was Deplin, which is a high dose, it's a medicinal methylfolate supplement. And my therapist said even for some people, that's all it takes. But not that I would ever risk, going off my mood stabilizer, but I'd actually take both of them.
Do you know why that is, that specific mutation can cause or has to do with depression?
Well, it just has to do with methylfolate is involved in brain neurochemistry one way or another. And if you're not converting enough, I guess essentially you have like a brain deficiency in methylfolate. Mm-hmm. So since you can't convert enough of it, you just take it preformed. Okay. And it helps to correct whatever is going on in the brain that is causing all this. So they put me on, so I'm all on that. 3 weeks later, I finally start to feel, functional again, and decide it's time for me to get back to Austin, because being at home with 2 dogs, just kind of a challenge. And love my mom, but let's face it, at this point in my life, there's a limited duration, just put it that way. And I'm just very much a creature of habit. So I headed back to Austin, still facing down what am I going to do now? Right. I did have to, I reached out to a lot of people who I'd been really awful to. And some of them forgave me and some of them didn't, including my mentor of like 17 years. And, that's tough. I tried to fix things at the shelter and they were like, because I got into it we had a little mailing list and I had a big aggressive blowout with a bunch of people. And they're like, it would probably be best if you stopped coming. And that was a huge part of my life. It's actually a huge part of what got me out of my depression in my early 40s, was giving me a focus and giving me something to do. So that was a huge loss. There's also, and this was something that I debated for a while, but it was really important to me, right? Like this comes out of, to me, the 12-step program, which is making amends. And I want everybody listening to this to realize, like, people have accused me of such, because a lot of people in the fitness industry are just D-bags. I have never tried to use my bipolar as an excuse for my bad behaviors. Did it contribute? Sure, but it was still me behind the wheel. Right? I have never tried to do that. Be like, oh, Lyle's using his bike. No, I'm not. Stop lying. I've said flat out, I'm not doing that. And they'll misrepresent me, but that's the fitness industry. And I did. For many years, I was like performatively awful to people on the internet, like just to do it. And I did. And I wrote this piece called An Open Apology to the Internet. I published on my website 2014, where I basically like, look, this is what happened. Not making excuses. I take full responsibility, but I feel like I'm going to try to do better, because I was really crappy to a lot of people for no reason other than to do it. And that's not acceptable. It was just important to me to take responsibility. And even for the people who didn't accept my apology, it was still important for me. Like I said, it's the AA thing, or the 12-step model of at least trying to make amends and taking responsibility for what I did. So that was 2014, but I was still kind of like, crap, now what? And one thing that's worth mentioning, so like I said, I was lucky. I needed the lowest dose of Lamictal, this mood stabilizer that I was on, which is great. No side effects, no real negatives, because that is one reason a lot of people come off their meds, is like lithium is notorious for people. It makes them feel terrible. They're moving in molasses. Yeah, they're stable. They're not having, hallucinations, but it's not a life. And so I was real lucky that I had really no side effects to speak of, and I was on a baby dose. But right about that spring, I felt myself kind of starting to ramp up. And it's hard to explain, but at least in my case, there's a very stereotyped thought process I tend to go through. And it can pretty much be summed up in, everybody but me is dumb. I'm better than, blah. I get real free with my money. Like it's just, but it's very, also my sleep patterns go awry. That's the really big one for me. Suddenly I don't need as much sleep, but I'm always energized. Like that's a big sign for me. And as it turned out, I happened to have an appointment with my NP like that week. Because even then, right, and there, like I said, there's this part of you that you're like, I'm fine. No, I'm not fine. I'm freaking awesome. I don't need help. I don't need anybody. I don't need anything. Mm-hmm. And once you cross a certain point, you can't listen to anybody. And I have learned I can cover pretty well, at least I think I can. Like, people, my mom's like, how you feeling? Are you manic? Oh no, and I will consciously slow my speaking down, get it under control, because I don't want to, like, I'm a little too good at that. And I was on this cusp, and I'm like, I know what lies behind door number 2, and I don't want to go down this road again. So I called my mom and I said, look, I need you to know this. I can feel myself ramping up. And even with my therapist on the phone a couple days later, she's like, so how you feeling? And there was half of me that's like, tell her you're fine. Tell her you're okay. Just tell her everything's great. And I was like, nope, I know what happens. And it's nothing good. And I told her, and that was a huge step for me, to basically be like, look, you've seen the consequences of this. You have to make sure And I told her that. And even before that, I had friends that I kind of interacted with on different frequencies, daily, weekly, monthly. And I told them, look, I need you guys to be my objective observers, because when I'm in it, I can't see it any more than a fish knows that they're wet. I said, look, if you start to see these symptoms, just me being overly aggressive for the sake of it, sleep, this and that and the other, I need you to tell me. And the deal I made with them is majority rules, that if 2 out of the 3 of them say, look, dude, you're in trouble, then they were right and I was wrong. This is also a very good reason to go to the DBSA meetings for me early on. And I did. I went weekly to the ones in Austin when I first got back here. If anyone is going to know what a manic episode looks like, it's other people with bipolar. They know exactly what it looks like. And they may not be able to help, but they can at least be attempts to be honest with you. So I call my NP and I go, yeah, I can tell that I'm ramping up. I can feel it. I can see myself hit spring. This is when I usually hit. She goes, cool, double your dose tomorrow. Luckily, once you titrate up on Lamictal, you can go to higher doses. It's just that initial 3 weeks. Doubled my dose, and I was fine 2 days later. And I've been fine since. Never had to increase my dose again. Like, that's all it took. Even if there's part of me that's like, I could probably go to half of that later in the year. Why? My prescription's cheap through Costco. I don't have side effects. I don't see any reason to do it. And I'm way past the point. Like, no, yeah, there's, in a practical sense, do I want to be on medication my whole life? No. But I'm also like, I'm not embarrassed by it. Obviously, I'm more than willing to talk about it. And I've had a lot of people come out, even when I put out this article where I was like, look, I'm gonna put it all out there. People, a good childhood friend of mine finally went and got help. Like, people I knew were like, just because you talked about it made it okay.
Yeah.
And luckily, I've always been a pill person, like a supplement person. So every morning I get up, I take my caffeine, I take my Lamictal, I take my Deplin. There is no going off. There is no, I want to see what happens. There is no, none of that that's part of me. Though it is interesting, sorry, backing up, when I first went to treatment, they're like, okay, these are the things we need you to do outside of your medication. Take vitamin D, I'm doing that for years. Fish oils, been writing about that for years. Exercise, been doing that for years. And they're like, basically everything that they recommended I was already doing or had, and they're like, that's probably what kept you from having this extreme episode for so much longer, because you were doing so many of the right things. Like, it was going to happen eventually. It was just a matter of when, more so than if. But luckily I had all those things. I'm like, yeah, it is part of my life. I have to worry about, apparently much later in life, meds can sort of stop working. But my current psychiatrist said, that's like when you get to 70, you don't have to really worry about it at this point. And yeah, so that's just, but again, I'm lucky. I've got one med, no side effects. I understand why a lot of people don't want to be on meds their whole life, because certain meds can be awful. Atypical antipsychotics are horror shows. They cause weight gain, pre-diabetes, all kinds of health problems. Lithium, some of those drugs are just absolutely awful when you're combining stuff, the combinations. I would go to the DBSA meetings and there are people with like body tremor, and you're just like, I feel so bad, because they're having to go through this, and realistically, they're probably going to deal with this on some level for their whole life. And like I said, I felt guilty for a while because of it. So that happened, and I was like, all right, well, it's 2014. Like I said, luckily I had income from the books. I pissed away my entire life savings. I don't know what to do. So I guess I got to go back to my field and start writing again. And as it turned out, right about then, I guess luckily, found out that someone had basically plagiarized one of my earlier books completely, my flexible dieting book, claiming to have pioneered it. She probably made more money than I ever did selling the book. It's the same person. She lied about being a dietitian, which is like class act.
I know who you're talking about.
Sure you do. And I got so PO'd about it. I'm like, because spite is a great motivator for me. I think spite is a great motivator in general, at least for a little while. And I'm like, all right, you know what? I'm going to go revise that book. Started writing, started to sort of expand itself and extend itself. And I'm like, I should just do this. And then suddenly, and like I said, I could definitely, in hindsight, hypomanic, probably cranked out 400 pages in a matter of 5 or 6 months.
Wow.
Just cranked on it. And that's when I got to the point that, oh man, I got to write about women now. It was that experience, that is what led directly to the women's book.
Yeah.
The difference though, because I remember talking about this with my, because at this point I was living in Austin. I would do, well, I started with monthly and then went to bi-monthly and then went to every 3 months doing Zoom with my nurse practitioner. Wasn't her preference. She preferred to meet face-to-face because some people will get a dyskinesia from the drugs. And I like to think I'm like the most boring patient because it was just like, once I was stable, it was fine. I had extracted myself from all of those bad environments. I just had to quit completely. Like I don't interact, period, because I couldn't do it casually without getting sucked into the drama. So I'm like, I'm done with that part of my life. And that was probably one of the best choices I ever made. Got into a healthier relationship. That was also a good thing. But then once a year when I was home for Christmas, I would go see them face to face, and I would go and get to see my nurse or see my therapist because he didn't like to do phone or Zoom by and large. But one of the things that had really changed for me is when I was younger as a writer, it was my passion, my obsession, my psychosis. Like it was a drive that is hard to explain. And I'm sure that's part of why I was successful is I am relentlessly, obsessively, like if I'm tracking down a problem, like the women's book, if I'm tracking down a problem, there is just no stop. It is all that I exist to do. My first book, unfortunately, our potential publisher at the time said, be thorough. You don't sell someone with obsessive tendencies to be thorough, because suddenly I'm pulling research from the 1920s on low carbohydrate because I got to read all of it. Like, but it was like, but somehow when I went back to it later, the second time around, I'm like, now it's just my job, in the sense that I had a much healthier approach to it. Like if I don't write for a while, it's fine. I don't have to feel guilty. And he goes, yeah, that's a much healthier. It's like, it was just different for me. Like, yes, I'm still I can be as compulsive about it, but it's just different psychologically for me. But kind of the end of the day, I'm like, well, this is the one thing I know how to do or that I'm good at. I don't have it in me to learn an entirely new field at this point in my life. Probably could, just didn't. And I'm like, so I'll just go back to what I'm good at, and sort of did that. And now, 5 or 6 years later, or actually no longer than that, it's 2022 now. So 8 years since I got diagnosed. Haven't had any episodes. Like, yeah, I still, spring, I get a little bit energized. And this winter got a little bit down, but still functional, still able to do what I needed to do. Haven't dealt with that kind of can't get out of bed for 14 hours depression. So I do. I miss the mania. Just need a little bit. And I told a therapist one time, I said, man, I'd love to be manic 24/7. She goes, it'd be a short life. I go, yeah, but it'd be awesome. Like it'd be awesome until you just finally ran out of gas. It would be a fantastic thing. So that's kind of like, the long and the short of it. And so in hindsight, I wish it had never happened. I wish I hadn't, but it led me back into my field. It led me to get stable, to get out of those environments. So I still wouldn't wish it on anybody, but it was what had to happen to sort of get me to where I am.
In your blogs on your website, you mentioned how bipolar disorder correlates with inflammation. Can you dive into that?
Yeah, so there's been sort of this, it is, somebody asked me like, okay, does inflammation cause bipolar? And the answer is maybe, or maybe bipolar causes inflammation. It's really hard to sort of determine cause and effect, but there's definitely there is an inflammatory link between the two. I forget I think it's with the depressive part of it though, more than the mania. And the last I looked at, it's been several years. They couldn't quite figure out, like, does being depressed cause the inflammation? Does inflammation cause the depression? Because of course, when I went looking, everyone's like, anti-inflammatory diets for depression. And it's like, well, I mean, it'll never hurt, but is that really what's causing it? And the answer is there does seem to be something there more with the depression. I did find some papers like low dose aspirin makes antidepressants work profoundly better, which makes a certain kind of sense. Even though it's like a 70-year-old drug, lithium, they don't really know how it works, which is kind of interesting. It also makes me wonder, who thought to try this? I always wonder about stuff like that when I see in medicine and someone just like, let's try throwing this at that for reasons. Like, who first thought maybe lithium will have this effect? And it does turn out one of its mechanisms appears to be anti-inflammatory. So the answer is, yeah, I haven't looked into it in a bunch of years, and I don't think I looked into it in that much detail. But there does seem to be a linkage, at least with the depressive aspect of it, not with the mania, and I don't know why.
So I've seen some doctors utilizing those ketogenic diets, like very deep ketosis, for people with bipolar disorder and other mental health issues. I wanted to ask you about that. Is there merit to that, and what are your thoughts on that?
So that's something else. And there is, and this is, I just find this interesting because, all right, the ketogenic diet clinically was originally developed for epilepsy.
Right.
Way back in the day. Because basically they knew that fasting helped with epilepsy, but obviously you can't not eat for the rest of your life. And the ketogenic diet was designed as a way to mimic fasting while eating food. So it's super popular in the 20s and 30s. Then the epilepsy drugs came through, and it kind of went out of style. And actually, it was this father whose daughter had refractory epilepsy who went and founded and kind of repopularized it. And then, of course, it became a thing for fat loss and dieting with Atkins, etc. What I find interesting is most or a great many bipolar drugs start life as epilepsy drugs.
Right.
And end up having either work for both or just end up, and there are at least a couple of case studies I've seen where a ketogenic diet has been able to treat bipolar, which tells me, going back to where we started, there is a shared mechanism. There has to be. Now, what it is, like, what does it mean to say it's a mood stabilizer? Well, that means that it's just, but mechanistically, what are these drugs doing? And I don't know. I mean, epilepsy, I think it has to do with electrical signals in the brain kind of misfiring. Is that part of bipolar? I have no idea. But yeah, there is at least some data that ketogenic diets can be beneficial there. People have, of course, asked me since my first book was on that, like, are you on a ketogenic diet? Oh, hell no, I love carbs too much. It's just not saying that it probably wouldn't be effective, but I won't adhere to it at this point in my life. And I think it's more for when people have really refractory, for reasons I have no idea. Some people just don't respond to medication. And in that case, you have to go looking for other options. And a ketogenic diet might be part, because is it possibly affecting inflammatory pathways? Yeah, it could be. I don't think, at least the last I'd looked, they knew why the keto diet helped with epilepsy. I mean, they threw out mechanism for years. They might have figured it out, but I don't really follow that anymore. But there's definitely a linkage here that makes sense. And I think we will kind of get to the point that it's like, yeah, we're dealing with overlapping neurochemistry with just different gradations in this. Like I said, I think we're going to end up with a cloud or a sphere when all is said and done. So yeah, there's some data on it, but I don't think anybody knows why it works.
What advice do you have for spouses and family members of people with bipolar disorder when they're going through a depressive or manic episode?
So, like I said, I can definitely look back and say factually that bipolar blew up a great many of my relationships. Like I said, start manic, and this is, just because this is funny, to give you an example of how ridiculously out of control you get. During one of the unhealthy relationships, like 2013, someone I knew, they were having some personal problems that are not worth getting into, but the easy solution was, at the 3-week mark, I asked him to marry me because, I'm completely head over heels in love beyond, this is the one, this is it. Like, you are just that kind of out of control. And I said, now that where I think is where you get some of the overlap with borderline. Like when you fall, like it is like this person is the tip top of the mountain. And so that was, and man, in hindsight, thank God she said no. The fallout from that would have probably been worse from the nightclub incident, because the nightclub incident was just money. There would have been all kinds of fallout from that.
Yeah.
So yeah, so I would go from that to being just this overbearingly loving, because again, you don't care about money. So it's like, you know, you're 2 weeks in and you're buying unhealthily overpriced gifts, just that kind of thing. And that's great until you crash in that depression and don't want to be social and don't want to be intimate and don't want any of that because you can't get out of bed. And that tends to be somewhat destabilizing for relationships. You don't want to talk about it. And for me, when I get manic, I can get very verbally aggressive with people. And so, yeah. So unfortunately, I kind of only know it from that side of it. What I can tell you, you know, sort of my most recent relationship is, and they had been a target of my aggression years earlier. Like I cut them out of my life for a year. I reached out and said, look, even to my closest friends here in Austin, these two female powerlifters that I've known for years, same thing. And I reached out to them. It was a fun phone call. I go, I guys, I'm sorry, I need to talk to you. You know, cool, come over. And I went over and they're like, what's going on? I go, I bought a nightclub, and they're like, just sit down. And like, they took me back because we had the other friend took me back and we're now, but I warned them, I said, look, this is part of me. This is something that I can't promise won't happen again. I can promise I'll do everything in my power. Don't go off like I don't do that. But mainly what I warned them from my perspective of this is what you need to look out for is if you see, like I said, if I don't get good sleep and I come in and I'm just like crazy wild full of energy, that's a bad sign. If I start to get like, just that they need to be aware of it. I mean, it's like I said, it's tough. It has to be supportive in the sense of like, I mean, if you're going to be involved with someone that has any sort of mental illness, you know, obviously that same individual I spoke about who went from drinking in the morning to institutionalized told me, yes, I just got married and my partner has asked me, can you just try not being bipolar? I go, oh, that's going to work out. Oh, these kids are going to make it. You know, you have to sort of be aware of what you're getting into, is to, you know, to be on the lookout for signs that either depression or mania is occurring. Because if you can catch it earlier before they get, at least for me, before you get too deep in, then you at least have the potential for them to listen. You have to be understanding and supportive, but at the same time, you can't put up with chronic abuse. I mean, again, my mom, she tried. It wasn't because she didn't love my dad. It wasn't because she didn't want him to get help. He simply refused to address the issue, and she couldn't do it. She couldn't do it. And then later in life, when he finally got a little bit more, like I said, they were great friends. They just couldn't be married under that circumstance. So it is one of those things. This is where these DBSA meetings, going and getting other perspectives, can be so helpful, because anybody can go. You don't have to be suffering from this. My mom went just to try to find out more about what her son was going through and how to deal with it, how to deal with me calling her on the phone and just being horrible to her. I mean, even more of a horrible kid than I am normally, but just, I mean, verbally abusive and just really awful. And sort of in that vein, I remember telling my therapist this one time, some of the things I said to people or did, they forgave me, but I haven't. At least not in the sense of, and he goes, you need to be a little easy. I go, no, because I can't ever forget that I did these things, because I want that to be in the back of my mind so that I never, ever let it happen again. Like I said, I know what lies behind door number 2, and I don't want to go through it again. It was, the hypomania was a blast. The tail end of it, not so much, when my entire life shattered. So yeah, and that, find out more about it, find out what they're going through, educate yourself, be aware of what can happen. I mean, what potentially can happen. So like I said, there are so many variations of what can happen with this. So some people have mild depression. Some people can't get out of bed for 14 hours. Don't tell them, can you please suck it up and try harder? Because that doesn't, it's non-productive. And it's like, can you try not having a broken leg? It doesn't really work that way.
Right.
So like I said, I've only been on the one side of it. So, what I did with my, was just make them aware, go, look, you need to be aware that this could happen again. Be very sure that this is what you want. I mean, I'm hard enough to deal with normally, because you're going to have to deal with my terrible jokes all the time that I retell over and over and over again. It's like, that's hard enough, but just be aware of that. Here are the signs I need you to look for, so that if it starts to happen again, you can slap some sense into me and get me to where I need to be before it gets to the point that I am going to blow this up. So that's what I did from my side of it. Even though my mom knew that I was dealing with this, it didn't make the awful things I said any less hurtful. I said I was lucky in that, my family, just because we are so close knit, was willing to overlook this and realize that I was actively. Now, if I hadn't decided to seek help, maybe they wouldn't have, and that is always the hard bit. And I don't have, when that happens, you can be supportive, you can provide resources, you can say, look, I don't even know how you would do that, because if you, especially when you're bipolar mania, it comes off and somebody tries to tell you, look, you're acting like this. Well, guess what? They're going to turn on you 10 times as hard, because they're going to see that as a personal attack.
Right.
And it's very hard to be like, look, I think this is going on. I'm here to give you support if you need it, or help, or what. Like, it's a really fine line. Luckily, my family is super supportive, and especially because I was seeking help. I've heard other stories of, parents that couldn't take it, had a child that had it really bad, out of control, doing, there's all kinds of horror stories, whether it's alcohol, drugs, risky sex, losing their money, can't take care of their child. And you'll hear about parents, they're just like, I can't deal with you anymore, and sort of write them off and walk away. Which, I mean, I guess at some point, maybe you have to, because I've seen the other thing, this isn't quite at the extreme. When you get bailed out all the time, it does tend to let you get away with some really appalling stuff. I had a friend years ago, and her daughter was involved, just kept sort of screwing up. And finally, my friend said, cool, gonna rot in jail for 2 days. And it was pretty impressive how quickly that turned things around when you realize there are consequences. The thing is, mental illness is different than just sort of behavioral, just, being a little bit out of control, that you're probably not going to. Like, you have to get into that happy medium where you're not so depressed you can't function, and not so manic you're out of control, to sort of have perspective of, okay, this is what's going on. And I do think in a lot of cases, like for me, I had to hit bottom. This person my mom either knew or heard about, ended up living in her car. Probably that was a good sign that it was time to, get a little bit of help. I think in that sense, the milder forms, you don't need help. You're awesome. You're awesome. Like you said, it's fun to be around, right? People get sort of dragged into your awesome, especially if you're paying for everything. So it's a little hard for them to really sort of be like, yeah, you maybe want to settle it down a little bit, because it's a blast at the lower levels. Depression, not so much. I don't see a whole lot good that comes out of depression. But yeah, it's tough. I said that's where, like, if you are in a situation where whether it's a partner, a close friend, a parent, a sibling, that's, I think, where you as the outside party find one of these, go talk to other individuals that have dealt with it themselves or experienced it. They may have suggestions or advice for ways to approach it, or tell you how people approached it with them, because it is such a fine line to go, look, you need help, and not make it attacking, not make it, a personal thing. I wish I could offer more, but I've only been on, the other side of it.
No, this has been so helpful. And
Yes.
we really appreciate you sharing your story, because
Oh yeah.
I think it's so important just as human beings, we want to know that we're not alone and that other people have experienced similar things. And, regardless of what mental health issues people experience, just to know that it's okay to not be on all the time, or to not be like happy all the time,
Yeah, like I said, that's a social, to me, that's a lot of a social media thing, but it is weird how much your brain really lies to you in these situations, like in a very real sense. Like I said, when I was really depressed, I would sit there, like I could look and go, look, I've written 8 books, I'm known in my field for this and that and the other, and go, I'm a fraud. I've accomplished nothing. I'm a nobody. Like, you can objectively look or look at the objective facts. Like, that's something that's actually really hard. Borderline deals with that. And borderline is different. It is more, I hate to say behavioral, but in the sense that you can't really medicate borderline. Borderline has to do with a certain way of thinking, which does have some similarities. Of someone with borderline will say something like, nobody loves me. And you'll be like, your mom, your dad, your friend, your boyfriend, girlfriend, you, me. And they'll go, no, they don't count. Nobody loves, it's the thought. You can show the factual data. And this is part of all mental illness. This is part of eating disorders. Go look, factually, this is, and your brain lies to you and says, no, what I'm seeing is not actually reality. In mental illness, your brain is lying to you about either how awesome you are and how great you are and how you're better than everybody and this, and that, and the other, or depression, how awful you are and useless and worthless, and you'll never accomplish anything. And you can't read this really, because I ruminate as it is, because my brain never turns off. And it gets worse when you're depressed. Like, you just sit there and just wallow in it. And I've read this super turgid paper to the effect of rumination and depression. It's probably adaptive because it's you trying to find a way out, but you just sit there for hours, just wallowing in your own self-misery. And like I said, I wouldn't wish it on anybody, even people I really don't like. It's just not, it's not a fun experience. But yeah, everyone listening to this, it's not a competition. Don't go, oh, now, mine's mild. I've never, bought a nightclub. You don't have to. I told my mom one time, she didn't think this was nearly as funny as I did. I said, look, once I rebuild my life savings, the next time I buy a nightclub, I know where I went wrong. She's like, that's not funny.
That's not a lesson.
I go, no, it's kind of funny. And I'm only half joking. But yeah, like, it's not. Your experience is your experience, no matter what it is. And if it is becoming destructive to your life, seeking help is not a sign of weakness. It's not a sign, this, like I said, I think we are generationally moving past that, past the, I don't know if you are familiar with the history. Part of why America has such a mental health problem is that in the 80s, Ronald Reagan, our very conservative president, decided that people in mental health institutions just weren't trying hard enough, and that they needed to just pull themselves up by their bootstraps, and he had them all released. That is a very old school approach. Like now, and I know we probably should, we are getting to the point, there is that concern with like, everything is a syndrome, everything is a this. And getting to the point of being over medicated, because everything is now, but I do think we're at least mostly past the idea of you can just fight your way through mental health issues. I mean, yes, there's the stuff, the memes online. There's one, and I forget who said it, and even if I did, I wouldn't. It's one of these trite celebrities, and he's like, if you're suffering from depression and you're not at least exercising and eating right and going outside and doing this, you're not giving yourself the best chance. And I'm like, dude, when you're depressed and can't get out of bed,
there's no chance you're going to do that.
You can't do any of that.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't disagree. I really don't. It's like exercise is great for depression. Good luck. Good luck getting up and even putting pants on to go to the gym when you don't want to get out of bed for 14 hours.
Right.
Great advice, but and again, when there are milder forms, there are relatively better and worse extremes of this. So yeah, great advice. Should you absolutely do those other things once you're out of the deep hole, once you're back? Absolutely. I would never say use meds instead of that, but sometimes you need the medication and or the therapy, and those usually go hand in hand, to even get to the point where you are, especially more coming from the depression end of things. When you're manic, you just don't care. You've got too much else going on because you got a nightclub to run. You don't really have time to get to the gym. But I think we're past that generationally in the sense of being like, yes, mental health, it is a biological disease. It is unfortunate at this point, not really curable. Although I do want to talk about one really interesting thing coming out of that. And the reality is, if you need treatment, seek treatment or seek advice. Don't feel bad. You're not alone in it. I mean, there will be people, and I don't know, you have dealt with this. I've dealt with this. I've had friends, people, and I've told them, I go, look, you will tell people about this, and they will cut you off, crap on you, tell you you're weak. It's like people who are trying to overcome alcoholism and are on the wagon. Yeah, you're going to have friends go, one drink can't hurt. Well, there are unfortunately people that are not going to accept it. And you have to just be okay with that. And that's fine. Find a support network of people that will support you in this regards. Not in the sense of enabling it, but in the sense of being there and offering support and being there when you need them. One thing I was going to say is, when I first got back to Austin, this is backing up to 2010 through 2012, and fell into depression because it was just like, all right, my last big hurrah of skating is over. Then I retired. I'm like, now what? And depressed, went to a therapist, and she goes, and I have very little social life. I work at home, I can literally go 24 hours and not talk to another human being in person. And this is really unhealthy. Because when you get depressed, you tend to isolate, which is the absolute last thing you should be doing. But you tend to not want to be super sociable. So like I said, I would get to the point I didn't want to be around myself. I did not want to impose me on anybody else, even if it was good for me. She goes, look, I want you to go volunteer somewhere. Go volunteer, but don't volunteer where you're in front of a computer, which is, of course, the first thing I did when I did a reading project. But she's like, nope, go do something. And my mentor, who had walked dogs for many years and couldn't, encourage me to go to the Humane Society. Oh, I didn't want to go. It took so much energy to go to even orientation. But through that, well, it's funny, they were supposed to get me around humans. What they really got me around was the dogs. I didn't know the name of a single person at the shelter. I knew the name of every dog in that kennel. But that led me to adopting my own dog. And you've probably known people, certainly for me, it's very hard to take care of yourself sometimes when you're depressed. But when you have anything to take care of, and in this case, it was a pet or a companion animal, it changes the focus. Because you're like, look, even if I don't want to get out of bed, I would rather them not poo on the floor. It forces you to at least do something, to leave the house. For me, it forced me to take my dog out and get some sunlight into my eyes, which is huge in terms of mental health and brain and neurochemistry and all that other stuff. So like that was a bit like that really, another friend who was dealing with it, she adopted a cat. That was probably what kept her from going to the end. She did have occasional severe suicidal ideation. So that was a big part of it for me. But again, it also gave my day structure. It forced me to leave the house. And at the time, my two friends who ran a gym, they're like, come train with us. Did I want to be there? No. Did I go? Yeah. I'd go to the gym, I would go to the shelter, and I would go home and collapse for 8 hours because I was exhausted. But doing that, it got me out of the house. What really happened, I've got a whole thing on my website about this too, was when I finally met a dog, just like, if you've ever volunteered, there's that one animal that just like, this is my dog. That made me, and that was when I started to come out, which then led me into the next manic episode and whatever. But even so, like that was a huge help for me. Just having that structure, something to do, and getting out and getting some sunlight and getting outside. So yeah, it is great advice if you can do it, but sometimes you need a little bit of help to get there. Other thing I wanted to mention, just because I think this is going to be the future, there is a lot of interest in using psychotropic drugs to treat this stuff. Ketamine, they're talking about. There's a company called MindMed that's developing, I think, an LSD-based drug that they may be using. And I know someone who has used, and it's drugs that they describe it as causing ego death. It's like mushrooms, like in that sort of psychotropic drug. They're like, yeah, for at least a little while, it reboots my brain.
I've heard a lot of, or I've read a lot of stuff about like ketamine specifically.
Yeah, and it'll be one of those things that it's usually tiny, like baby doses. Like it's not the stuff you would use to recreationally. And what's interesting, and again, y'all are way too young to remember this, Timothy Leary back in the 70s and 60s, he was he was an LSD zealot. He thought the whole world would just turn on to LSD, we could fix all the problems, and that got him into a lot of legal trouble. But he actually believed that using small doses of LSD with proper therapy, so basically you could briefly he called them imprints in the brain, basically certain sort of structured behavior patterns that we tend to pick up over the years, that you could temporarily break them down and then reset them with a proper therapist. And I do honestly think that 50 years down the road, he's going to end up having been more right than wrong, because that's where the research is going. That's where, again, in conjunction with therapy, probably in conjunction with other things. But I know there's been some work with like ECT, with like for people that are like really refractory depression, using certain types of electrostim. And I think, to a first approximation, I suspect it's kind of like a defibrillator for the brain. Like I have a feeling that mechanistically, it's sort of whatever's going on in the electrical signals, it's kind of zapping them so that at least reset temporarily. So I do think there's a future there that's bright in terms of, if not a cure, especially dealing with the real hard cases, with the real extremely refractory ones, like schizophrenia, like the ones that really are like, you're going to be institutionalized for the rest of your life. I like to think that there's going to be some hope for that.
Can you mention to everyone again where to find you online, where they can contact you, and where they can get your books?
Yes. So my website is, as always, bodyrecomposition.com. And I do have a number of articles. I talk about my bipolar recovery and what I went through, talk about my time at the shelter, if that's something, and just volunteering in general, which can be, especially when you're depressed, go do something for somebody else. It will make you feel better about yourself. Even if you can't take a shower that day, go help somebody else and it will help. So that you can find those articles on my website, my store.bodyrecomposition.com, Facebook group, Body Recomposition. We got tons of experts in there about all this stuff. I did want to mention again, so DBSA is the Depression and Bipolar Support Alliance. They've got not only a website with fantastic resources, but they have listings of all the support meetings, if that is something that somebody, and even though they call it depression and bipolar, there are individuals there that have any number of things. Like I said, when we would go around the table, be like, depression, anxiety, bipolar, PTSD, trauma. There was an individual there with what at least used to be called dissociative identity disorder. Well, what used to be called multiple personality, and we don't call it that anymore, with DID. So you name it. So it's not just for those two things. There's also NAMI, which is the National Alliance on Mental Illness, which is a little bit more general. Deals addresses all sorts of mental illness. So they've all got great resources, probably have links to, practitioners that they can recommend, and support groups for people that are dealing with this. And very honestly, like if you're on Facebook and you just want to talk to me, just PM me and I will do what I can. Like I said, I'm not a medical expert. I cannot tell anybody, I cannot give recommendations or advice, but if you just want to talk about this privately, I am more than happy to help. I'm happy, like I said, I'm an open book in this regards. So like I said, I'm happy to talk to anybody about it. Like I said, send me an email, whatever, PM me on Facebook, and I will do whatever I can, if I can help. So